Okay, so this presentation is something we've kind of touched on some of these issues before. And this also goes back to a best practices article that came out some last year sometime, or the year before even maybe, on some of the changes that are coming for Canine. Some of these are based on some of the analysis that I and some others have done. Myself, Team Ramirez, and a partner, JD McDonald, have been involved in a review process where we have been assessing some canine units for internal review and peak performance issues to provide recommendations based on a bunch of different things. And during those things, we've looked at agencies to see what issues arise and have been problematic for them. And during that time, we've looked at policies from across the country and dealt with a lot of expert issues. So these are some of the recommendations, again, that we're putting forth that are not any kind of requirement for anybody. They're just things that are issues that arise and that will continue to arise to basically cause grief for agencies and for canine handlers. So we were going to jump into it and go through it, but again, these are just recommendations and considerations for agencies and for handlers to think about. No one's telling you to change anything. You kind of have to take a step back. The nature of canine units and specialized policing is that you kind of have to look at yourselves and see what's best for you into the future, what's causing problems, look at the litigation trends in your area, things of that nature. Okay, first slide. Okay, so again, it's about change. Everything changes, right? We need to pay attention to what changes will contribute to our peak performance and survival, and what's going to help us to thrive in the 21st century and going forward. As agencies begin to take hits financially, cops are going to jail, prosecutions are occurring to some degree. And there are some agencies across the country that are actually reducing or eliminating their canine units. And some ways they do that is they don't outright say they're going to eliminate it. You'll see like a handler will go out on sick leave, or a dog gets injured and they just don't replace it. This way they don't have union issues. They just let these units in their departments that are problematic just fade away one dog at a time. And you don't want to see that happening. You want to see agencies maintaining full strength with their canine unit, or even increasing dogs. But with that comes, consideration for what's a best practice for agencies to thrive into the future. Next. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back. Let me have the next one. Let me have the one before. Okay. There's a lot of talk about qualified immunity, which is like hey, we're fine as long as the Supreme Court says that we're okay and we're immune from prosecution or for litigation on various issues. And that's not really the case. That you have to be a little bit more concerned than just to say everything we're doing is fine because we have qualified immunity. In fact, there's a lot of different ways to negatively impact what we do in police work, and the fact that states and other organizations are constantly taking a run at police agencies trying to reduce their qualified immunity or their coverage is a bad thing. So some of the things that are occurring is that there are states like Colorado and others that are trying to limit qualified immunity for its officers. With the different names for their acts that are going before their state legislatures and stuff, trying to come up with these assembly bills. New York City had one, and Colorado and New Mexico, I think, had one. While these Supreme Court decisions are great, really you want to pay attention to what's going on in these communities instead of just saying, hey, everything's okay. So important is that the considerations are what you do, what you don't do, your acts, your omissions are within the course and scope of your employment. not outside it, acting in good faith, and the things they try to look for, the cracks in the armor, if you will, are reckless disregard, indifference, gross negligence, and of course those other things, acting outside course and scope, which is basically beyond the training. They train you in one way, you're not consistent with your training. These are ways that sometimes that these outside entities can try to penetrate your armor, if you will, try to get to you and try to cause problems for you or your agency. Okay, next slide. These are some of the issues for negligence concerns and litigation that contribute to most areas of police litigation. Failure to train. You've all heard all these before, and if you're a supervisor, you've definitely heard these before. Failure to train is a big one, and that is usually you guys are really good at making sure that you're training properly, that you're training routinely. So the agency oftentimes will reduce training hours, or they'll allow folks to skip training or even skip certification. I've seen handler teams or agencies just not have a requirement for certification, and the time just goes by, and it turns out this individual who gets into trouble, they look at training records and they see that there's been a routine to let people not routinely certify when they're supposed to, and they stay on the street. So when a bad bite occurs or something happens, that's one area where they can go after you. Look, you're not even certified to be out there because you didn't certify, and that's where those arguments begin. And the other big one that we've seen, or that is an issue for everybody, is failure to identify or remediate problems or overlooking issues. Now, you all are aware of a bite or an issue or an individual handler somewhere in your region where a thing has occurred and no one has said anything about it. It's just kind of faded away. And it's probably not on video. It's probably not, maybe didn't lead to litigation. I know several of those things back when I was a handler long time ago that, people just kind of covered it up, and hey, it was they made that decision to go left or right, and whatever, just because you couldn't get the dog off, or, something occurred. But these chronic or repeated problems that you see that are overlooked or ignored are going to cause problems. And you get that gut instinct, like that person is going to be a problem, that dog's going to be a problem, whatever. So those are issues with failure to identify issues and remediate them timely. And with the training issues is documentation and records keeping. So some of your agencies are amazing at keeping records, and these online CATS programs and some of the other canine programs online are really well designed to document training records and deployment records. And I'm a big proponent of deployment reports. Every time a dog is deployed, taken out on an assignment, other than minor training, there's documentation. And everyone says that's the main reason for that is to cover yourselves for court. But the other main reason for it is so you're paying attention to your dogs in your program. If you have 4 dogs and you have 5 or 6 dogs, you need to have a standing record of what's going on with the dogs. It can be auditable, so you can pay attention to what the issues are, make sure that problems are remediated, issues are identified. And then when you do go to court, you can print out a report and you've got everything. So the agencies we've looked at, even incidentally, most of them did not have accurate or complete reports. And that in and of itself is a problem. When you say, why aren't you keeping data records, or you're not able to track your bite ratios or your training issues or concerns, or who's been remediated or whatever. And then there's a mad scramble to do it. And then of course you show up in court with all these records that have been put together, scotch taped together, backdated, and you have a problem with that. So one of the things that everyone needs to do is to make sure that they're maintaining accurate, consistent records. And consistent by that, I mean, you have one handler handling their documentation one way, and you have one handler doing it a different way. Everyone's using bite ratio with a different outcome or different measure. There should be, this is where supervision comes in. You have supervisory issues. They're just not paying attention to how the data is captured, whether it's captured consistently or how it's entered or analyzed. Brings me to failure to supervise, which is a big one. If you're going to have a canine supervisor, they should be qualified to provide oversight for your canine unit. If they're uninterested in the position, if they're informal, if they're really an administrative leader and they just happen to be, the guy who got the roll of the dice to be the canine sergeant, we've all seen that. That's common in a lot of units. It has been forever. A lot of us were in that position as well. You're an acting person. You have a primary role, and this is your secondary function. That's not really healthy for the unit. This is a unit that has high risk, high liability exposure, and it should have qualified oversight, qualified supervisors. And those supervisors should be accountable. They should be fully accountable for the decisions that are made in the field. And they should be fully accountable for controlling and overseeing all aspects of the canine unit every day. The handler should be answerable to them. Everything should be auditable, so that there's a clear trail of oversight that's trackable, if you will. Because a lot of times you roll in and you see the handlers are running the unit, and a lot of you have that. The handlers, the strongest personalities, the informal leadership is running units and making decisions, and whatever is being told in training is not being done because of the unit. The unit alpha is deciding that we don't do it that way, we do it this way. And you can have problems that way when you have a formal leader and you have informal leadership and culture all kind of conflicting. Poor retention practices speaks for itself. Everyone knows handlers that either shouldn't have been handlers, shouldn't have been selected, or should have been deselected. They're not properly disciplined or reassigned. There's politics. This is the guy that, or the handler that oftentimes will be friends with somebody and get into the unit because they're buddies, and there's all kinds of problems with them. And then there's dissension in the unit, and don't seem to be answerable or accountable as everyone else. Everyone has seen or heard about those kinds of experiences. So these are things that are palpable. Everyone's aware of all this kind of stuff in units or in your region. And these are things that do come out in litigation and in every other way, and it can cause a lot of problems for units. All right, next one. Manel concerns. The main reason I put this in because everyone knows what a Manel claim is against the entity, and the entity itself can be held liable for pattern and practice civil rights violations or 1983 claims. But the impact of custom, which is the culture of a unit. And so in this regard, when it's speaking about custom, there are customs not received any formal approval. It means that customs or cultures have just evolved within a unit or within a police department. And we can all talk about different types of cultures that have occurred that in various police departments that have been on the news, that the supervisors or the chief level officers, staff officers are not even aware of what's going on. And that in and of itself is a big problem. So when something occurs, I think the bottom line on this would be, if something occurs and it's caused by culture that's not formally part of the organization, it's kind of the way things have been done on morning watch, in the back row of morning watch or whatever. And the organization or the chief level decision makers don't know about it, or they claim not to know about it, trying to distance themselves from whatever it is, whatever the behavioral patterns are. That's not good. That's problematic for the organization, that the folks at the top don't know what's going on at the bottom. And of course they should. They should know what's happening at the bottom. Supervisors are there, or they just don't pay attention. I can tell you all kinds of things from my experiences where things are happening and either the supervisors are involved in it and no one else above knows it, or they kind of know it, or they are supposed to know it, or they don't want to know it, kind of thing. Anyway, that's where culture can formally really impact an organization. Okay, next slide. So again, I love these proverbs because these quotes, because they really talk about how to take advantage of the fact that we're in a process of change right now. And in some of your organizations, there may be no impact at all. You got to score it away and everything's locked on, and Canine will be fine in a lot of ways. But in other areas, the political winds are different. You know, you have organizations that are trying to gut Canine. There have been in the Marshall Project and others, there is a very public opinion that Canine should be eliminated. There's no, you know, post Selma, post 1980, 1990, 2000, there's no way dogs should be part of policing, and that is actually uttered in a lot of ways politically across the country, which is fine. That's the same as saying defund the police. No one's defunding anyone. You know, there might be some modifications which will eventually go back the other way, and we'll have full funding. But these are things we just have to pay attention to, and we have to be mindful of what the winds are and how we can best survive and thrive. Okay, next. So our objective is really should be best practices, which is essentially having a best practice organization so that we're, as an organization and as handlers, so that we're in a best position to take advantage of issues when they arise, identify problems, solve them for the betterment of the organization, and to ensure peak performance for ourselves as well. So that's just a definition for best practices for us. Next. Okay, so these are some of the concerns. We've talked about these a little bit before. There is no requirement, no specific legal challenge involved in these particular areas, but these are areas that are coming up on CNN. These are the areas where people are focusing on, and a lot of them do come from video. Some of them come from body-worn video that just make it out of the news, because where 2 years ago, when I was in LA, boy, you did not release a body-worn video. You didn't do it. You had a press conference. You briefed the incident that occurred, the officer-involved shooting or whatever occurred. And you said the investigation is underway, and you were serious. You weren't telling the public that something that's not occurring. But the body-worn video is part of the confidential internal investigation, and everything will be released, the entire thing, including the adjudication and outcome after the investigation is completed. That's not the case anymore. Now, body-worn video, investigative video of any kind, CCTV, whatever, cell phone video, whatever, everything's being put out there right away. And part of the reason is the community is demanding accountability from day one. They don't want to wait. They don't want no comments anymore from agencies. They want to hear about what's going on. Now, the agencies are not coming up with a final adjudication on things and saying what an outcome is, but they're releasing the video. So what's happening is you have everyone watching the incidents on TV and drawing their own conclusions, which I'm going to tell you right now is perfectly okay. Everybody was scared of releasing these videos, and even part of the video up front. But in reality, what it's doing is desensitizing people to the fact that police work is not pretty, it's like surgery. It's got to get done, but nobody wants to actually watch it. But now that they're getting to watch it, you're not getting that feedback of people up in arms over basic police incidents, even officer-involved shootings. As a matter of fact, the analysts are getting involved and actually are being able to articulate and explain what's going on. So now you turn on CNN or TikTok or YouTube, and you see an officer-involved shooting from any perspective, whether it be a storefront or a police body-worn camera. And people kind of get an idea of what's happening, and then you're able to identify the threat or not, or at least discuss it and discuss the gram implications. So anyway, let's get to the first slide and I'll go through these, but I just wanted to kind of tell you where these are coming from. Okay, so these are the issues. We'll just go through what we have perceived, or that I consider to be some of the issues of the day. Now, again, your policies or the policies of the folks that you represent may be completely locked on, and you have a good policy, and that's what counts. What counts is that you have a good policy that's enforceable. It is enforced, and it is trained to. There are cases where agencies have poor policies that are conflicting. So you have a policy that a bite policy or a deployment policy that conflicts with a use of force policy, yet a dog bite is a use of force. And you have a lot of dancing around the terminology of these policies, and they should be kind of straightened out and streamlined. Or you have policies that are not enforced or not trained to. And you have some policies come out, and I know agencies that have put out policies and just never trained to it. They just kind of handed it out and assumed everybody would absorb it. And that's really not the way training works. So some of the considerations is what's happened in the last couple of years is Graham has taken a hit. Graham, which was the federal floor for use of force policy, has been a great asset for law enforcement. But over the past few years, you've heard terms like proportionality and de-escalation. Those are not Graham terms. Those are supplements. Those are new additions to Graham. So what you're seeing is Graham, that has been the floor for law enforcement policy, has begun to grow and evolve. And we are almost going back to a continuum type of environment. And I'm not talking about every agency is doing this. Most just have a basic Graham policy. Most agencies do. But the future trend in law enforcement is to impose de-escalation strategy requirements, as well as proportionality considerations. And the word necessary is in a lot of policies now. It's sneaking into policies. So you have a subjective, objective assessment and requirement being put on officers, which is a little bit on the confusing side. But Graham is really considered to be a tool for which you would look back on an officer's use of force and not apply 20/20 hindsight and look at it from his shoes. But in reality, agencies are now taking the position that that's fine for looking back and assessing and adjudicating, but we need tools to further instruct and tell people. Don't tell them just to be reasonable. That we look at whether they were reasonable, but we can't necessarily say, hey, you have to go be reasonable. We have to tell them what that means. So you're seeing a lot of changes in policy dynamics across the country to include those kinds of things. And de-escalation is part of that. It's like, yeah, we want you to be reasonable, but we also want you to use these de-escalation tools that are effective, and proportionality measures and necessity. So you start with things like, was a use of force necessary? And was that force proportional, to determine whether it was reasonable? Anyway, what does this have to do with dogs? The dog is being released into a perimeter to search for a suspect. The dog, likely, if you have a find and bite policy and the guy's hiding behind a dumpster and you pretty much know he's going to be in an accessible location and the dog bites, that's considered, most agencies consider it a use of force. Therefore, it's best to consider Graham-based factors when you're deploying the dog, because of the likelihood that your decision-making for the release of this particular tool is going to result in a bite. Now, if it's not, it's different. But to have a policy that basically has that consideration up front basically solves a lot of the problems. The reason I'm bringing this up is there is a lot of deployment criteria policies that don't have any of that. It says when you're chasing a suspect that's wanted for a crime, and a dog would be the best tool to locate this particular suspect, you may use the dog, and they release and there's a bite. And then it turns out it is or is not what it purported to be when you first arrived at scene. But the reality is handlers are going to be accountable for the use of the dog. And I personally had a bite once where the guy's brachial artery was severed and he almost left us. And it was a good deployment, but if it was just a shoplifter wanted for a crime, and I just was waiting for kind of a tracking thing, and it was a felony shoplift, but this guy ended up getting a very serious bite, then there would be some questions asked, which is fine. Again, I'm all about accountability because it's perfectly okay. So my recommendation is to have these considerations up front when you're deploying the dog. When the decision making is done by the handler to deploy this rather onerous intermediate level tool, to have a little bit more considerations when you're doing it, and just be able to articulate, which is what? 3 sentences in consideration. The nature of the crime in your policy, I don't know what it says. Most of the policies I've looked at across the country are very weak in discussing nature of crime. Very few say felony. Very few say known dangerous suspect. They just say, some of them say serious crime, but they don't define it. So whether it's a GTA or not is all up in the air. And it could be, ends up being a teenage person who stole his parents' car and they report it as a GTA. You get a bad bite of a younger person and things like that. So I don't mean to ramble about it. I'm a policy person. I'm a big policy person. I'm really big on writing policy that is broad enough to cover everything, but specific enough to ensure that cops know exactly what's expected of them and to ensure that it's trained to properly. So they're always actively evading escape. There's always a risk posed. It's why you're using a dog, and there's always a crime that you should talk about in your deployment report. Anyway, these are just some factors to think about. Our policies are important. If you take a look at your policy, do a policy checkup, and you don't like what you see, you might want to go to your higher up and say, hey, we might want to change this or tighten it up or modify it a little bit, or whatever. As long as you have a good policy in place, so that's what's important. Okay, next. Duration of the bite. This is your proportionality, your de-escalation. This is where, let's step back for a second. The Trump White House in 2020 put out a guiding document for law enforcement. This is the Trump White House, the Republican Party, put out a guiding document for law enforcement, which said we're strongly recommending that every agency in the country develop a policy on policies which include de-escalation, big emphasis on de-escalation. Most states have followed through and put forth some level of reform-related recommendations to their agencies. Most of them are all recommendations, and they're not requirements, but most of them are recommendations. And then a lot of agencies have made those changes by having de-escalation requirements as a separate policy and training concept, or combining them with the use of force policies and making it all kind of part of one library. I've seen a lot of changes to use of force policies over the past couple of years, and most of them are good. I haven't seen any that were really bad, because the pushback, there's kind of a pushback process, and hey, you can't tell us to do that or not do that, and then they modify it a bit. So like de-escalation, where it's required, is now more if it's feasible, we want you to do it, and then they train you to it. So where it's reasonable or feasible, we want you to use de-escalation. But one of the big ones is proportionality. And proportionality essentially just says that the force you use has to match the resistance by the suspect. That's what we would prefer. So you can't continue to hit the guy with a baton after he got his hands up in the air, he's doing a Rodney King. Okay, and you continue to tase and use the baton. Okay, that's kind of a classic proportionality example where the guy says okay, where physical or conventional force does knock him down, cuffing him would have done, yet you continue to do what you're going to do. I'm not commenting on that case. I'm just saying that's a good example if you want to envision one. De-escalation is kind of more of a vague concept, but these are all things that go towards use of a canine. So how long is too long to keep the dog on a bite? I've seen the dogs on the bite for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, off, cuff, put them up, put them in the car, dog, 4 or 5 cops get on, cuff up. I've seen a dog on a guy for 3 minutes. Okay. 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 3 solid minutes. And it wasn't a massive fighting and biting and the guy was running and a rebite. It wasn't like that. It was the individual was at a particular location or coming in a car, halfway out of a car, and they wanted the dog to bring the guy back. And they were like reeling him in, on a long line, on a search line. There was just a lot of stuff that everyone was perfectly okay with. But there's a point at which those types of bites are not okay because of the reasonableness of it, the proportionality of using a 110-pound mal on this particular case. The individual was wanted for, I don't know, GTA and something, and the dog, it was a big dog, and boy, he was really doing a number, and then it transitioned to another part of the body, and it just continued. And when you ask, and they just said that's the way we do police work. Okay, well, that's fine, but it's maybe it's not fine. Maybe it's time to reassess. No one should be mad at anybody because that's the way police work has been done. But it's time to take a look at how those things are done and how the dog is used, how long the dog is left, when the dog is outed, things of that nature. So where we don't look at those things at all, and we refuse to review them or talk about them, those are the things that are going to cause problems into the future. So those are just reasons why we put this up. You need to kind of talk about it and have those conversations. Again, we've all heard these things: the actual likelihood of escape versus just saying it as a boilerplate rogue statement. The dog bite, is it increasing his resistance? So I'll get to that under pain compliance. But when the dog is biting, he's going to resist more. Yelling, "Stop fighting my dog," is not necessarily going to equate to he was fighting my dog. He's resisting the bite in a lot of cases, and it just is what it is. So using the dog is not quite what it was before. And the boilerplate can only hurt us in the future. And I've read some boilerplate that it's the same sentence over and over in every report, and it's been okay. It's been okay, but in the future, it's going to cause some problems. Okay, next. The hard out. Okay, this is kind of a misunderstood one, I think, or kind of confusing one. A hard out is where, as a matter of routine, you leave the dog on until you decide to get up there and take the dog off. Okay, that's fine. Most agencies actually do that now. They don't want to rebite, all these other reasons. But there should be occasions when the dog can be called off the bite, especially when the person has given up and you're making your approach. But if you combine this, and again, I don't want to give the impression that if you send the dog and he bites, you should always call him off or e-collar him off when he submits necessarily. But there are occasions when you want to consider doing that, and that occasion should be consistent with your training and your certification, where the dog will recall off the bite. It has no choice. It's your tool. You can't say the tool is defective. I trained to that, but in the reality, the gun doesn't work. I train on the range, it works fine, but I know that if I'm in a shooting and I have to shoot more than 2 rounds, this gun's not going to work. You can't. That's not okay. The dog will recall if that's your expectation of this animal and this particular tool. So I've heard a lot of people in court say, I couldn't get the dog to come off, and the jury is very concerned about that. They don't really like the fact that you cannot get because they imagine their kid being bit and you're yelling out or whatever. There's problems. And I've seen videos again. I've seen a lot of videos, and most of them are just they are what they are. They're the current state of police work, and we're just trying to change it for the better into the future. Not get mad at anybody, but I've seen a couple where again the dog was choked off for a long time. Anyone in the room would feel that this was an arguably long time. And the handler kept trying to give commands to the dog, and this dog would not come off. And it was clear that the handler wasn't really intending the dog to come off. He was not really trying to get him off, like you would if it was a kid or some accidental bite. This was the process of taking him off a bite. So these are things to talk about. No mandates, no, these are recommendations that you do this or that, but these are considerations that, if I'm remembering back 20 years ago, it was not unusual to send the dog, and when the guy became fully compliant, was out of the car, hands up, you'd call the dog off, back to you, and move forward in a tactical configuration and use conventional tactics, take the guy into custody, have him walk back to you, whatever. But now it's just every dog is left on until a team can move forward and remove the dog. And again, hard out is often the best option, but is it in every single circumstance? And that's something for you guys to just talk about. And if that's the way you're going to do police work, then that's the way you're going to do police work. But it's something to talk about. And when you watch these videos, when you do these debriefing reviews, which is what I mean is you turn on a canine video, and you watch it as a unit or individually, you're always debriefing the tactics of other officers. And it's okay to do that for your own concern, not to critique others. We don't do that. We're doing it to discuss internally how we will improve what we do. In LA, everything we did was debriefed. Everything you did was debriefed. And there were learning points, virtually everything, at least a serious use of force. Debriefing points and learning points were drawn from it and then processed and at least talked about in the room. No yelling, screaming, finger pointing, but it was talked about so there can be improvement for the next time around. And then if it's a big deal, then those improvements get sent to training, and training can make sure that everyone has that. And that's called a learning organization. Learning organizations are constantly learning from what they're doing and talking about it. Even if it's fine, you just talk about it. That went great. You should do that, or we should do that every time. So there's always some kind of consideration of how to be better and improve our practices and performance in the future. Next. Pain compliance. Here's one that's becoming more and more at issue for agencies. I got a call from an attorney who was involved in a case. It was I can't remember who they were representing, but it was a pain compliance bite where they were absolutely up in arms about this bite. The guy was a pursuit of a felony suspect, armed felony suspect, and the dog was inserted and used for distraction and pain compliance to get this guy handcuffed. And this team of attorneys was absolutely sure that the pain compliance shouldn't have been done here. It shouldn't be done at all. There's no room for it. We want your opinion. I said, of course it should be done. That is one of the biggest attributes for a police canine is compliance, which is either maybe just the deployment and the show of the force itself. Well, he put the dog right next to him, and the dog was barking. That's why we have them. That's the impact of the canine. That's the value, extreme value of these dogs is in a lot of different respects. But then he inserted the dog onto his leg. Okay, what were the circumstances of that? Was he doing nothing wrong and he was handcuffed and waiting for transport? No, he was rolling around and he was still possibly armed and he wasn't cuffed. Okay, well, my point is that there is oftentimes a time and a place for a pain compliance or distraction bite. Guy's trying to arm himself, is armed, is in a, whatever the circumstances, is altercation, whatever, and you need to get his attention or get him to comply with you. That can be a proper use for the dog. But it's not always. Again, these are, as a general rule, a dog probably in a best practice scenario should not always be inserted into a confrontation. And sometimes inserting the dog into a confrontation onto a bite or using him just to get pain compliance or as a use of force is not always the best option. So again, enough said really, because it's just something to talk about and to think about. And when you're looking at these debriefing scenario videos, when we all do it, you're looking at TikTok has them now, YouTube videos, and you're watching. ask yourself, yeah, you probably can, by policy, can use the dog, get away with it. But should you? Is that a right scenario? I mean, we've all seen dog piles where, so to speak, where there's 8 officers wrestling with this guy who's not armed. He's not arguably armed or reasonably believed to be armed. He's just a guy fighting, and the dog comes up, and the dog is inserted into the problem, onto the leg or the arm or whatever. And it doesn't always help. So we just want to think, because you can come up and you can use the dog, you can insert him and get a bite. Is that the best way to use the tool? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's put the dog up and jump in and grab a leg. But again, just something to talk about, something to think about. The real question is, does it increase or lower the resistance? How does it work to de-escalate the problem, if you will, to get this person into custody? Okay, next. Body cameras. Okay, this is a big one for me. Handlers avoid body cameras. They always have. SWAT should avoid body cameras in a lot of cases because they're involved in tactics, unless they're live streaming and there's behind the scenes decision making. A lot of times we don't want that stuff to get captured where we're looking at the tactics of operations, warrant execution, things like that. But Canine is an operational asset that there's no real reason to not use body cameras when everyone else is carrying them. And you look around, and the only ones that are not using body cameras, having to use them, is the Canine. Initially there's a clear we all know why. We all don't want what we do on camera. We never did. My God, I'm an 80s guy. I became a cop in 1981 in South Florida. You did not want cameras out there. And in San Bernardino, when I was out that way, San Bernardino County, you didn't want cameras.
Okay, I think we lost Scott. Okay, we'll get everybody back on track here. Sorry about that. Next we have Steve White. He's retired sergeant trainer from the Seattle Police Department, and we'd like to get going on Scott, or on Steve. Steve, are you ready?
I am. Can you let me see if I can throw something up on the screen, if you can give me the ability to present? Is it just me?
Yes, go ahead.
So I love everything Scott talked about here, folks. This is really important. We have to realize that the time has come for us as a national canine community, an international canine community, to rethink what's possible, because people outside of our community, outside of the canine profession, are rethinking what's preferable. Whether we like it or not, those are the people we serve, and that's the way things are going to go. I live in Washington State, which, as a response of all the turmoil in 2020, and actually even starting before that, has been creating laws, putting restrictions on police officers beyond what we see in Graham versus Connor. Scott laid out exactly why Graham versus Connor was created as an objective standard, particularly during the examination of tort claims. Okay, that's great. But police department said, we need something more. And yes, they will go through 2020 hindsight, looking at what you did, and they'll use something called decision point analysis, looking at things moment by moment as the event unfolded, and then basically looking at that moment and deciding what was the best thing that could be done there. What was done, this was reasonable, but is there something could be better? And then they try and craft policies around that. And if your agency isn't doing this kind of analysis, get ready, because it's being taught at the highest levels, and it will bleed down from the executive levels where they're talking about how important this is down to us. Even in small departments, as long as they go to some of the executive trainings, they're going to see it. So get ready for decision point analysis. It's there. And emphasis is going to be placed on proportionality, necessity, and de-escalation, just as Scott said. I've created this mind map of this whole concept of change is coming. And you can see that it's interconnected. The problems that we face come from outside our own organizations in many ways, but they're exacerbated by our internal behavior. And that's the only thing we have control over. We don't have control over what the community thinks or does, but we do have control over our behavior and what we do. And so I think it's really important to follow up on Scott's key points on this, is that, picking the right people, picking the right dogs, training. And when I say training, your training needs to align with your tactics, and it needs to align with both, not just the federal law, Graham versus Connor, but what your state and local laws are and your department policy. You need to go ahead and train the dogs to task. And those tasks are ones that align with your department's tactics. Don't pull people out of their roles by being at the mercy of the dog and the handler moving through the building at a pace that differs from them. That's a sure way for a sustained beef against an officer, and we don't want that. We want people surviving in this. And Scott's subtitle on this was about having canine thrive well into the 21st century, and we're going to really need to do that. Now, another thing that we need to think about in this is the only way you're going to survive the examination of your training is if you not only train how to do the task, how to bite, how to release, how to do that stuff, but also for how the loop end of the leash works when it comes to decision making. And if you don't train decision making and you don't document that you've trained decision making, there's a huge gap for you. And that liability gap actually is a reflection of the safety gap. The reason we have a high liability exposure is because we have a high safety risk exposure. Because Canine is the only tool in the inventory that literally drags officers to a confrontation with a suspect. And then once they're there, that tool is also a possible less lethal weapon. And we have to realize that that puts us in a unique position, even more so than SWAT. And so we have to think about how do we go ahead and do this kind of training. And the answer is it's got to be scenario based. You got to bring people in there and put them in a position to make decisions. And then, as Scott said, you debrief. Don't just debrief your deployments, debrief your training. What worked, what didn't work, what were options, what can we do this, what is going to keep us safe, keep suspects safe, keep innocents safe. Because if you can keep the most people safe in the event, the odds are your liability exposure will go down and the complaints against you will go down. The community standards are changing. It used to be, hey, our job was to bring people to justice and keep people safe in that order. I think communities around this country are shifting in large part saying, your first job is safety. And if you can bring people to justice in that process, that's what you should do. That's your job, is to bring them to justice while doing the best you can to keep people safe. And that's a cultural shift that we're going to have to make and figure out how this is going to go. And Scott has laid this out really well about where this is going to go. And I'm going to just shift down here to the bottom of this mind map and talk about supervision. Training is important. Policy, as Scott said, so important. It's got to be crafted well. But the biggest thing I see that's lacking in our canine community right now is the people at the first level of supervision on up really don't know a lot about canine when you get in there. And so as a result, they don't understand what's going on. And then if you get some that know a lot about canine, but they haven't had experience as supervisors elsewhere outside of canine, or their experience is limited, then they aren't good at really holding a bunch of officers with a lot of initiative and real self-starters accountable and keeping them, making clear that they understand the lanes that they're to operate in. And, we've got Bill Lewis on this call, and he is providing training for people about this. And I think there's a need for us to create training for supervisors and maybe managers and executives about what canine can deliver for you, why it's so important, why it's so valuable. Scott laid those things out, but also why it's really important that police executives, police managers, and police supervisors really clearly define the lanes for handlers to operate in. Then those handlers have to adopt that mindset that they are trainers, that everything they do is about making this better all day, every minute of the day. You have no other thought in your head except, how do I make this better? You know, what's important now and how do I execute it? I love what Scott said in this, and I'm going to go ahead and fade myself out on this and stop my screen share and ship the ball off to Don again.
Thanks, Steve. That was really good. I appreciated everything you had to say, and it does kind of connect with Scott. And I'm sorry, Scott's presentation, which was in its last slide, he didn't quite get a chance to sum it up or finish. So right now we're going to go to Dr. David Ferland, also known as Lou to those of us that know him well. He was a police officer with a 110 person Portsmouth, New Hampshire police department, and he was there for 30 years and ended up as the police chief. He brings a perspective, from the bottom all the way to the top. We always enjoy hearing Lou, and so I'd like to give Lou you the reins. You got it.
Well, thank you, Don. First up, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Steve, for your words and comments. And, I'm going to approach this from just a quick different angle. I've been out of police work now since 2012. I teach college courses. So I've kind of shifted my focus into teaching, and I'm able to look at police work from a little different lens now, not being completely immersed in it as chief or even as a dog handler. So anyway, what I'm going to do is there's a whole lot to unpack between what Scott and Steve said, right? And so I'm going to focus in on one thing. I'm going to underscore one thing. I'm going to look at it from a different lens, and then I'll offer one new thing. So I want to look at the duration of the bite. And I'm going to look at the duration of the bite, not from a legal standpoint and Graham and all that stuff, which is legitimate, and obviously we need to be concerned with that. But I'm going to look at it from the public's perspective. I just got done a case helping out a handler from a case that happened in 2013, and he just had his day in court. Now, that's 9 years ago. And this handler has been on job, under suspension, on light duty, you name it. He went through the ringer on this whole thing, public prospectively. Now, we know there's a whole lot that occurs from the time an incident happens until it gets adjudicated in court. And we see cities burn because of what might have happened from the event until the officer has had their day in court to be able to go over the legal merits of the case. So I'm going to talk about the duration of the bite. And, I'm going to look to an example. Now, Scott, gave us a quick demonstration that lasted 3 seconds, and we couldn't take more than 3 seconds because of the ugly pause, right? So let's say we're hitting somebody for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Imagine that going to 10, 20, 30 seconds. Okay, that's a whole lot of punching, right? Imagine that's a nightstick hit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Uncomfortable? A long time? Am I making the point? Our tasers go for the first ride is 5 seconds, right? Boom, hits the guy, 5 seconds, stops. We have to redeploy the trigger. It gives us an opportunity to reassess what's going on. And then we'd have to justify why we're pulling that trigger again on that taser, do we not? So what I'm suggesting is you really need to account for almost every 5 seconds of the bite. Boom, the dog hits, gone for 5 seconds. What is in your report, or what is going to be observed visually on that camera and in the public that suggests that that bite should go on longer? What is it that now has the situation demanding the dog continue biting? Is it just because the guy is trying to get the dog off the bite because it hurts like hell? Now, if you've never been bitten by a dog, which I would assume every handler here has, you know the first thing you do is instinctually you get your hand on that dog's nose to try to limit the amount of impact that the dog is having on your body. Or is the bad guy truly fighting the dog? There is a difference between somebody trying to get the dog off the bite because it hurts like hell and actually aggressively fighting the dog. And you need to be able to explain the difference between the two and explain that the person is actually either fighting the dog or there's a legitimate reason why the dog is continuing to fight. Just like you would have to explain why you're continually punching the person. There is no difference here, gang. So I offer it from that lens because you're going to have to explain it in public long before you explain it in court. And your whole life can be completely turned around in that interim time between the time it happens and the time that you end up going to court and probably found legally okay by it. But cheapest, you've been through a whole hell of a lot. So make your life a little bit easier. So that's the different lens I'm looking at it. And then the one new thing I'm going to introduce to you is, we mostly use our dogs as a search tool. I want you to promote your dog primarily as a search tool. We all know that you have the toughest dog in the world. I will grant you that. I will not argue that. I don't need to see the snarling devil dog t-shirt on you to prove to me that you have that toughest dog. And I certainly don't know what the value is of constantly showing children in the schoolyard how your dog can chase down the bad guy, bite him, and bring him to the ground. I'm asking you to revisit why you might be showing someone the aggressive part of your dog, because I don't think you take out your baton and start smacking something for a schoolyard demo, and I don't think you're taking out your taser, and you're certainly, I hope, not taking out your gun. So I don't know why we constantly want to show the aggressive aspect of the canine. And if you do show the aggressive aspect of the canine because you want it to be an educational piece, let's say to a Rotary Club or something, please make it a defensive bite. Make it so that someone is beating up on you, the handler, and you have to deploy your dog by hitting the button on your belt, and the dog comes out of the car and saves your life. Do it that way so that you can show that the dog is primarily a defensive tool. And be sure to make sure you're also showcasing the dog actually primarily as a search dog, and then secondarily as a defensive tool. And then, of course, we all know that the dog will chase down the bad guy. So anyway, that's my one thing to unpack, the duration of the bite, taken from a different lens, the public perspective lens, and then, of course, introducing something new. And that is perhaps we showcase our dog more as a search tool. And if you're going to show it as an aggressive tool, we show it as defensive rather than an offensive tool. So thank you, Don. And thank you guys for being here. And thank you for the presenters for sharing their expertise with us.
Thanks, Lou. I appreciate your thoughts and comments. They're always welcome here. Next, I'd like to present John Kerwick. He is a former commanding officer of the MTA Police Department Special Operations Division in New York City, which is the largest explosive detection canine unit in the United States. John, you are on.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I certainly am glad I'm not formally presenting because the people in front of me covered everything in great detail, and I'm proud to be here. So what I'd like to just reiterate, and I'll be fast, is we have been having these discussions internally with the five of us for over a year now. And we all come from different backgrounds, and we're not here solely for the USPCA. We're here because we care about the canine industry. Whether you belong to another organization or you don't, whether you certify with whatever group, it doesn't matter to any of us. We just want to make sure that the canine industry continues to grow instead of going backwards, that people don't get at risk and they don't go to jail. So with that, I'd just like to say, we have two ways to do these webinars. We could do them, just record them and put them up on YouTube, or we can do them live like we do them now. And the reason we're doing them live is because we have all this knowledge in this room right now. And I'm hoping that we're going to get some feedback from some of you, just to put up your hand, agree with us, disagree with us. Just let's start a conversation, because there's so much knowledge here on this screen right now. I would love to hear from somebody, just, hey, that was a good point, that was a bad point. Maybe you have better ideas. That's why we learn from each other. I just want to get the conversation going. And with that, I'll turn it back to Don.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. And I'd like to give Scott an option to finish if he would like to sum up the thoughts or.
All right, thanks, Don. No, actually, you know what? I just looked. That was on my last slide. Isn't that great? I was just talking about, I think it's a good point to end with the cameras. Is don't fear what you do. You guys are doing an amazing job. Canine is, there's nothing better. I was so proud to have been able to do that for it wasn't a long time, but I was able to do it, and it was just the best job. You're doing God's work. So don't hide it. Just explain it. That's like any police work. You know, I do these reviews on these DOJ cases, and you hear these cops like, shut your cameras off, shut your cameras off. It's like, don't. You don't need to. Everything's going well. You're doing this amazing task. You know, they don't want it on camera for whatever reason, because they may have to use force, and that's perfectly okay. Just explain it. Explain what you're doing. It's the ones that are problematic with cameras, and I only talking about that because it was a point I wanted to make, was the folks that aren't sure what they're doing is right, and then they don't want it on camera. I've seen that too. Like, okay, you're going to go around the back, like, shut the camera off, and it's like, oh, come on, now, you know, that was, you were going into a place you probably shouldn't have gone, or doing a thing you should. But you guys are doing God's work. This is amazing stuff. I mean, using the dogs the way you do them. And if it is a tool for reviewing and seeing what you do and talking about it in the future, that's fine. And it is going to take a little time for people to understand it and to desensitize to it, but that's part of it. I mean, how long have cameras been out? For quite some time. Folks are desensitized to a lot of the force that's used because of the cameras. So embrace that, embrace them into the future. They are the future, and don't worry about them. Other than that, I appreciate the opportunity to present. So thanks, Doc.
Thank you, Scott. We have a question from Josh Stenza. Okay, thought Josh raised his hand. I'd like to make a comment about something that I know that Steve has talked about in the past. And it has to do with the records. I think we need to understand that obviously we know not everybody knows what we do in Police Canine, or even how it's done. So sometimes when we write our records and we put things in, what is it we want to accomplish today? Search a big building or something. Remember that people, when they look at that from the outside, I'll give you what a judge said to me one time. I thought that when a police dog graduated from school, he was certified that maintenance training, maintaining, was all that we did. So you have to put it in your records when you're asking the dog to do something different. As we know how dogs learn, a change of context can be just enough to throw the dog off, where he doesn't perform as well as he or she should. And so you put that in there, and they look at that as a failure, but you didn't say anything about changing the context or changing the number of cars you're going to search, or the type of track that you're going to do now, that it's different, that it's new for the dog, that he has the possibility of making change or making a mistake. So you have to put that in there. So when they look at that, because if you remember, the Supreme Court ruling of 2013 says certification by an agency is good to go for the probable cause. We will decide whether the dog could really do it when we look at the training records and deployments. And so that is the ultimate test. And the training records, as Steve White is so famously used to saying, is the breadcrumbs of the way you did something and how you can go backwards when something happens with the dog and pick it up during one of those previous sessions. So remember, don't put enough information in there so that they understand what it is that you are trying to do on that exercise, and then you in court can say how you can tell them, if you wish, to how dogs learn. They learn by being presented with many different contexts and things like that. So that is something that I think is really important, is the training records. It's good for you because you know where you are, because if you think if you're a patrol dog and you are doing multiple different things, plus you are also a detection dog and you have to train that, it lets you know where you are, what you did the last time you trained. Josh, I had you on there with a hand raised. Did you want to say something?
Don, Melinda's got a question in the chat box about training records.
Okay, I got Josh has just started to talk. I think you're on mute, Josh.
Can you hear me, Don?
Yes, I can.
Hey, I just want to say thanks for putting this out, and also just kind of reiterate on the importance of really doing all the scenario-based training, how important that is to all the handlers out there, documenting all that. So again, just a really good reminder to do all that with all the good tactics and everything else. So that's all.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. Melinda has a good question. And it goes like this. I'm good with report writing after an incident, and all your info is awesome. The one question that comes over and over is exactly what is the most important thing or things to document in your training records, especially with patrol work. Scott, did you want to try that?
I think number one is to make sure that you're training, you're documenting everything. So there are agencies, and you can look at the online data software systems, or if you're doing it hard record, that's fine. But whatever you're tracking should be auditable. And if there are some agencies that say, hey, every time you take the dog out for a break and you throw the ball and you do some obedience work, I want it to be tracked and trained, under the database somewhere. The problem with being that minute is that if 4 or 5 of the handlers aren't doing that, they're like, oh no, I'm not going to document every time they take the dog out. I'm just going to do regional training or whatever. Now you have a gap between what some people are doing and what some people are not doing. And it looks like you're not doing what other people are doing. So I would have a standardized format for what all handlers should be doing, and then an audit system so that every week the supervisor is looking back and saying, hey, did you do no training this week? Oh, no, I went to Tuesday night training. Okay, it's not on your records. And so everyone is consistently documenting whatever. Or if you're required to pull them out twice a day or once an evening for self-initiated, training in the field, you get that opportunity. You want to check that box. Everyone should be doing the same thing. So at the end of the day, if you're going to put all the training in there, if the agency decides they want to have every topic covered, what did you train? What did you what issues did you train? Who was there with you? Things like that. It's fine, but as long as you're basically documenting your training, I think that, and this goes for all law enforcement. You're basically documenting the training that you're doing and any remediation issues. If it were to come up in litigation, you're fine. You'll never have a problem with showing what training you're doing. It's when you print out the training record and there's nothing on it, or it shows one Tuesday last month, and wait, I remember doing every Tuesday, and now you're backfilling. Those are the things that cause problems. So if I understood the question about specifically what should go on the training record, that would be my response.
Melinda, why don't you get on, turn your volume on and ask the next one.
So I love that. Thank you. Like Josh said, and we've already said, we appreciate everybody that joins in on these, and especially those of you that do these trainings for us. This is amazing stuff. People are missing out. So along with training records, I know one of the things that I struggled with as a handler, but specifically as a supervisor is, and now as a trainer, one of the things I push is that, okay, so we have a dog that has a sticky out. He's a little, having some trouble with some outs, and we work that, we clean it up. Great, that's perfect, good day of training. And we come back to the next training day and the dog kind of goes backwards and he's having the same problems again. So we document that again and we add more to it and try to, I mean, where does that line get drawn, I guess, is what I'm questioning, is that I know what I do, but I want to make sure that it's everybody agrees or understands how important it is to document what you did to correct it and to show down the road that it truly has been corrected. Am I in the right track there? I mean, that's kind of what I was curious about, is how you document a problem, and then how do you document that you fix that problem? How much is too much or not enough?
I'll chime in, Don, because I think my answer is a little different than Scott's on this, and they're not. It's not that one's right and one's wrong. Is that they complement each other. Scott's giving you an answer about what meets court sufficiency, what's going to withstand challenge in that regard. I'm going to speak as a trainer, and first off, I think we have to get out of the mindset that it's enough to just say we did a thing. We did man work, we did tracking, we did building search, we did area search, and that's it. We need to go ahead and start looking at our training records as the way as essentially our guidebook for future training, because we have a history of how we got where we are. And every training decision you make on every day is based on where you are. Not where you think you are, not where you wish you were, not where you fantasize you are, not where you think the dog ought to be, but where the dog actually is. So you got to get a baseline, and knowing where you finished the day before and actually knowing it. Like, if anybody here does weight training, anybody here ever lift weights? What's the first thing a trainer is going to tell you about lifting weights? Is keep a training log. Know exactly how much weight you lifted for how many reps with how much time between sets the day before, so that when you come in today, you know where you're starting. If you try and do it by memory, you will shortcut your progress. So I'm a firm believer in establishing metrics. In other words, things that are observable, measurable, and objective. Instead of saying, we did a 300-yard track. Yes, 300 yards is a metric. Good there. And the dog performed well. So here you have an objective thing, 300 yards, and then you have a subjective thing, the dog performed well. What does well look like? Melinda, you have high standards. But Don Slavic, he doesn't care. He's going to let it go. What looks great to him is like, man, that needs work. All right. And so that's why you don't want to use subjective language. So you hit measurements and you say that track is 300 yards with 2 turns and starts on grass, transitions to pavement, finishes on gravel on each of the 3 legs. There are 3 pieces of evidence, with one in about the 50% mark of each leg, and there is a suspect at the end. All right. So now you say dog was followed the first leg within 15 feet of the trail all the way, hit the downwind side of the article, hooked back, and downed at the article. Dog continued on, overshot the first turn by about 6 feet, circled right, came back. So this is verbose, but this language will help you understand what your dog is doing and how you got where you're going. And you repeat this all the way through that. Yes, it's more work, but it is the kind of front-loaded work that will make your performance better going forward. Will you identify problems? Will subpar performance be reflected? Yes. Why? Because I'm only human and my dog ain't even that. And so we will we will always wind up unintentionally designing an exercise that exceeds the dog's capacity. If the dog fails, it is only because we have asked it to perform something for which we have not yet adequately prepared it. And please note that word yet. You always got to look at that and say, okay, great. Now I've identified this edge in performance. My job is to systematically push it out. And your subsequent training records should reflect that. Why? Because you have a record that says, I saw this thing and now I want to work on it. If you don't want to put forth the effort to have the best product, the best dog possible, the best tracker, the best evidence indicator, the best suspect control dog that releases in a moment, then yeah, keep your records really brief. But if you really want to be the best, observable, measurable metrics that are objective are the way to go. There's my answer as a trainer. Does that create points where people could say something where they say, look, here's a flaw, here's a mistake? You bet. And I've done due diligence and I addressed that flaw. And that's, go ahead. I'll take that in front of a jury any day. But
What you have just observed and heard is what it's like on our Monday afternoon meetings. Lou, go ahead. You're on mute.
Okay, I was just going to say the same thing. Now we've gotten to our Monday afternoon meetings, and I'm going to add just a couple things to training. One is, what's the purpose of a training log? And I tell people two things, really. One is it's a diary for the handler to be able to figure out where they've been in training and where they need to improve upon. It tells them what they've done and where they need to go. Okay, it's like a diary. It's the breadcrumbs, as Steve calls it. And then the other part is later to be able to show that the dog is reliable and he's predictable. And let me give you two examples. One example is a patrol dog one where, let's say, for example, you're training your dog to track, and every time you end the track ends with an aggressive bite. Well, it's probably likely that when the dog is deployed on the street and he comes across somebody and the handler is not in complete control of that dog, meaning the dog might have a little more leash or the person might be in an area where the handler can't see, well, it's probably going to end in a bite, correct? I mean, that's kind of predictable if you think about it. And it would be pretty hard for me to defend you as an expert witness to be able to say that, it's not likely that the dog bit the guy. Yeah, it's likely that the dog bit the guy because in every single track that the handler has done with this dog, it's ended with an aggressive bite. All right, let me switch that. I just did a case where it was a search of a car along a busy highway, and the argument was that the dog was distracted and, the scent was blowing all over the place because of the passing cars. We were able to show at least 60 different searches in training that handler had done with this dog in a busy highway condition. Okay, so now we have something that is a predictable behavior on the dog and something that's reliable because we were able to go back into the training logs to show how that handler did some very nice scenario-based training, and we were able to use that training to show that the dog was predictable and show that the dog was reliable because the dog worked in similar circumstances. Now, it doesn't always have to be exact circumstances, but it should at least be something fairly similar. And I hope that helps. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Lou. Appreciate it. I was just reading something here from Steve. Anybody else have a question? This is the time.
It's these questions that really turn this into that Monday meeting that I love so much, that we have this almost like a fireside chat or the chat that's in the bar room type of thing where, we're done with a day of training or a day of certification and we're just talking, and it's awesome. Go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to throw this out to not so much our presenters, but the people online here. We brought up a point about decision making and the reason, not that a dog is capable of going out and engaging with somebody, but what led the handler to rationalize that it was fulfillment of the law, that it was going to be okay, and he was going to be able to deploy that dog properly. Whether he recalled him or not, or whether he engaged, that's not what I'm asking. But we need to train the handler to figure out why he's going to do what he's going to do, and then be able to rationalize it. I think we all agree upon that. But I'm going to ask this: is there anybody on here who's actually incorporating that as part of their training right now? Because I'm a big believer in muscle memory when it comes to tactics. If somebody approaches me weird, I'm going to blade myself. And I don't do that because I was born that way. I do that because I was trained that way. So I think a lot of our handlers are taught all this, but do we ever ask them in training to verbalize it? And I think that's important. I think that's a big piece of what we're all talking about today. But I'm convinced that there's people on here who are doing it. And I just want to hear from some of you that might be doing it. So I'm going to throw it back out to everybody here.
Matt Ross? Matt, there you go.
Yeah, sorry. So we do a lot of scenario-based training. And to speak specifically to what John was saying, we had a scenario where there's a traffic stop and driver runs off, and the handler has to make the decision of, am I going to send the dog immediately, or am I going to wait and track later, clear the vehicle, all of our normal tactics. And it was up to the handler as to what they wanted to do. I chose to go ahead and release the dog, and our decoy then started shooting at us. So I think scenario-based training is the way to go, because later on you debrief that, we debrief that, you know, what would you have done, what should you have done, or what could you have done. And obviously tracking the person later probably would have been a better option had I seen furtive movements towards a weapon and stuff like that. So that's all. I was raising my hand just to tell John that we do that kind of stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. Lou?
Well, let me give it to John first, because he's the one that posed the question. I saw him raise his hand, so I think he has an answer for Matt.
I think he was just acknowledging it.
Okay, so listen, one thing I would add to that is you've done the scenario, you've debriefed, you come up with a new solution that would be better. Repeat the scenario. Even though you know what's coming, repeat it so you get that muscle memory, and you have it documented that you critiqued and repeated, and the scenario ended how? Did you perform better? You know, how did it end? So that we can now show that the dog is reliable and now predictable. And so don't forget the critique and repeat, the C and R, critique and repeat part of your training.
You know, patterns and routines, you know, we know that dogs learn from a pattern or a certain routine. What we don't necessarily always understand, and I think what some of our SMEs are saying here, is that we also as handlers may react in a pattern that we've gotten used to that's not very good as far as a protection or keeping ourselves safe, or what's the routine. And so we often just follow what we were doing in practice, like giving the warning and standing in front of the doorway, or just aimlessly following a dog around a building while the dog is loose searching for human scent. But we didn't realize that he was taught in the beginning, and his pattern is that I run to the other end of the hallway, often out of sight, and then I'm just a handler just walking casually by, waiting for the dog to start growling or barking, and then all of a sudden somebody jumps out from a place that was never checked. So we are also victims of those patterns. And what I think the message is that we need to present as many scenarios for us as we do for the dog, because we are both learning in each one of those situations as we go, and how we can one is how our dog's going to work, and maybe decide further training, but we also learn to make ourselves better on that also. So any other questions? This is great. This is the way it's like on Mondays. I'm not kidding you. I mean, we just sit and talk about dog training, what's happening in the world, and all those. Steve, take care. Hey, listen, you got a second to tell these folks what you're going to teach next time?
Oh, yeah, for next month, we're going to do 1,000-Hour Eyes, about a 1-hour presentation on a systematic approach to teaching people how to read their dogs. And the nice thing about it is most good handlers already know how to read their dogs, but this is a great way of communicating to a jury, to people who work in another agency and maybe have a slightly different dialect of the canine language that we all speak, or to your own superiors about why a dog behaved a certain way. And it involves, it's based on the work of Dr. Steve McKenzie, the late Dr. Steve McKenzie, who was a brilliant trainer. And it's kind of my homage to him and the way he taught me to think about things and systematize things. I think you'll like it. It's an hour well spent. And at the end of it, you'll be shown how to create your own scent work indicator database and apply Pareto analysis to it. So it's like the mixture of standard police canine practice and Six Sigma all in one.
I think we got that scheduled for something like April 20th or
20th.
something. Yeah.
20th, I
Okay.
believe.
And we'll get the word out just like you got it here, or you can send an email. I think most of you responded to executive director at uspcacanine.com. If you want to reach out and inquire about any of that, we'll be putting that online pretty quick. And we do appreciate everyone attending one of these, because it's for all police canine. I cannot say that enough. It's not just for USPCA folks, it's for everybody, because we all need to get better in some areas, and this is one way to do it. And this one it was a good session because we did a lot of talking back and forth, and that's always the best way to do it. So if no one has any more questions, April 20th is it. Lou said, oh, here's Dave Duncan wants to say something. Go ahead, Dave.
I just want to thank Steve real quick. Well, thanks everybody for that. And I want you to thank Steve just for mentioning Doc. Doc was my mentor. Went to SUNY Cobleskill. I was his TA for many, many years. Never even planned on being in the police industry, much less the dog industry, until, I just happened upon it and saw they needed a situation where they needed some dogs trained many years ago. And that's kind of where I fell into. But you choked me up for a second, because Doc, I still talk to his daughter, Dawn, pretty often. So
yeah,
appreciate you mentioning him, and that meant a lot to me. Thank you.
Hey, glad to, man. He was a giant in my heart, man. Absolute giant. The nerdiest giant I've ever known, but a giant.
Yes. No, he was definitely a quirky odd man, especially when he tried to lunge a bull in a brown pen. I was there for that one. I don't know if he ever told you that story, but yeah.
Yeah, tactless training. That's the way to go.
That's right. That's actually how I met my wife, believe it or not. So
one of the first books I bought.
Yep.
Hey, I got to go, guys. I actually have to prep scenarios for a Washington State Police Canine Association seminar. So I'm going to bounce. Man, much love to you all. The canine community all around the world is going to be changing. Things are changing, and we'll change with it.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. I think we're just about done, so I think we'll call it. Just remember, if you have, this will be on USPCA YouTube channel, and you, as soon as the tape comes out, and you can recheck it out. Let some of your friends know where it's at, and we'll talk to you the next time around. All right, everybody, take care.
Take care, everybody.